Yes. All right.
Okay.
Yeah. So I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Kind of did the classic piano lessons as a kid. Then I found trumpet in like middle school and did that for a while in kind of a jazz context. Um, and was sort of dabbling in like arranging stuff for the band and that kind of thing, but wasn't really doing original music. And then went off to college in Massachusetts, a small town, Massachusetts, and then thought I was going to do physics, thought I was going to do math, all these kinds of things, but I always was doing music on the side and sort of was finding myself focusing more on that. So, like, probably halfway through college, I kind of decided to focus on that fully. Um, yeah, like Eric said, it's most of my education has been in sort of a classical world, but I never really performed classical music, and I wasn't really um, like I guess my in to music wasn't really through classical. So I was kind of always having these sort of two sides of things where I was like very heavily studying very like kind of 20th century composers and sort of like your classic music education realm, but then everything I was doing was like more um like kind of composing within a studio, like using a studio as an instrument kind of thing. Um and was also kind of into film scoring. I still do some of that a little bit, and have kind of been more interested in recently finding ways to use, yeah, like field recordings and found sounds as a means to sort of build instruments, which I'll show some of that today. And I kind of, the last 2 years I was in New York getting a master's degree at NYU, and that was kind of where I was like very heavily diving into that. But I was also still doing, I guess, composing for like a concert hall setting. I've, like writing stuff for string quartets and things like that. And for me, I've really enjoyed that, of sort of kind of being able to bounce around. And I think it's just kind of how it is just sort of always constantly trying to find what's inspiring and you and figuring out what is going to make um, sort of your artistic life move forward through that, and not getting too bogged down in one thing if it's not at that time being uh, not at that time the inspiring thing to you. So just kind of chasing what's on your mind at the moment. Um, and so I guess that would be a good place to maybe dive into a song.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you do you have multiple projects going at the same time? Like, or
yeah,
are you focusing on one thing at a time?
I think I would say like technically I have multiple things going at the same time. The like degree, I would say there's like one thing that I'm like kind of for like a little bit more in like a panic mode about at that time. If there's a deadline involved or something, and that's kind of becomes the thing. But I feel like there's always kind of um, there's always probably like two or three things that are kind of bouncing between.
Sure.
Um, and then sort of, yeah, as deadlines come up or things like that, then I guess maybe shifting more towards focusing on one thing. But yeah, I think, yeah, I could talk about that too. I think that's another thing that has, because I'm I guess in my career I'm kind of in this like just have finished school, figuring out exactly where I'm fitting in, what's kind of the route to have an actual make a living. And
Mm-hmm.
um
It's
and
important.
yeah, and the pacing of everything is like, school's very quick. You have like, you get an assignment, you have like a few months to do it, it's going to get played, all these kinds of things. And then real world is more like it's on you to make your idea happen, and then it could be 2 years from the actual writing of it that it sees the light of day or something like that. And kind of recalibrating to that,
Mm-hmm.
which can be tough. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I guess I
Yeah.
can play some stuff now.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Let's see here. Um,
Logic
just
Pro.
Yeah, so I use Logic. I use um, Logic, Pro Tools, and Ableton a bit. Kind of bouncing between them. I usually write in Logic just because I've been using that the longer, and it's kind of the quickest for me to like get ideas down without there being resistance of like not knowing how to do something or something like that. But I do a lot of mixing for other people. I do kind of like a random thing I've done recently is like editing podcasts, and I do that in Pro Tools. Because for me, that's like, it sounds, I don't know, I'm not trying to bash it, but like Pro Tools looks very uninspiring to me, which is actually good for those kinds of things. Because I'm not like, I'm just focusing on like the task. I'm not trying to like create things.
Yeah.
But
Oh,
yeah.
Before you play music, I think talking about learning setting versus real world sounds like life as a musician is a patchwork of a lot of different gigs. Like basically whatever skills you have, if someone asks you, if someone will pay you money for it, and you're like, yeah, I know how to use this DAW software, and I can mix your podcast, you say yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you definitely
exactly.
do.
And even if you don't even if it's like you know how to do half of it, you say yes, and then you just learn how to do the other half as well. And that's how it goes, and it works out in the end. All right, so what I'll play here is it's the second track off the album. It's called Mayhap, and this is kind of like, there's a bit of an intro track here that maybe I'll go back to a little bit, but the second one, the album was kind of the first thing that I put out into the public that is, I guess, like different from my more classical stuff. Everything else that's, publicly available is very kind of like a soundscapey, very slow. And I was pretty heavily working on things that had a little bit more rhythm to them, had a little bit more of like a beat to them, a little bit more of like a traditional song structure. And so I really wanted it to, from the beginning, I knew I really wanted to like have an opening that was like kind of sort of like an announcement. It like hit hard, and this is like this is where we are for this album. So that's what I was trying to do here. I also just play it through and then can talk about some of the stuff. So if you can't hear this, let me know.
We can hear it.
Let me play it not in the Logic session, so then it won't
Sure.
It won't blow up my computer.
Pretty amazing.
Sorry about that.
There's a lot of tracks.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've gotten better at, is being okay. Like, people will, being okay with just like, you just add what you got to add and it's fine. And like, no judgment on that kind of stuff. I used to try and like, if it doesn't look clean, then then it would be bad. But all right. Still hear this?
No, not right now. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'll go like halfway through.
A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience.
All right. Can we open it up to questions?
Totally. Yeah. I'm gonna try and see if I can freeze some of these also while that's happening.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Steven, go ahead.
I know Eric said that you do a lot of different styles. That being said, despite that fact, are there any particular, I guess, people who you would say were your biggest inspiration? And would those people all be one general style, or is it all kind of different depending on what you make?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it definitely goes in waves, but I don't think it's necessarily tied to like the thing I'm working on. It's more just like the natural kind of what I'm listening to at the moment. And for this, I was listening to a lot of there's a band called Son Lux. It's a trio that does a lot of like kind of sound design based. Here I can put the chat. There's a lot of like sound design building instruments, kind of like sampling sort of orchestral instruments in ways that like totally blurs what they are, and just like building these really massive soundscapes. And yes, that's true. Yeah. And the kind of like lead of that band is a guy named Ryan Lott, who has he does sort of solo stuff too. And he sort of takes the lead on the like instrument building sides of things. So I definitely get a lot of inspiration from that. In the last like maybe last half of writing this album, I was listening to a lot of much more like solo singer songwriter kind of stuff. Um, uh, Madison Cunningham was someone I listened to a lot of. Let's see what else. So it wasn't really solo, but there's a group called Florist I was listening to a lot of, which are like very much not what this sounds like, but it was more like this stuff is very dense, at least to my ears. It's like there's just a lot happening. It, you know, it kind of works together, but there's just a lot happening. And in those, and I think that that's sort of been my default is if I trying to move along, if I'm like have writer's block, it's add something, see what happens, rather than like if you're, you know, if it's just you and a guitar on stage, it's kind of the opposite. It's like to build a whole song, you have a lot of limitations, and in Logic you don't. And so I think it was listening to that as like inspiration to sort of remind myself to look more in on what I have rather than like try and throw a bunch of new stuff on it. So I think that that's a long answer to your question, but I think that the main thing when specifically for the album was sort of I was listening to things that were, I think, fairly different than what I was writing, just as sort of like refreshing my ears and sort of like getting out of the constant state of what this was. So
I feel like that's pretty common. Like there are a lot of artists who listen to music that you'd be like, oh, well, they make this style, so they must listen to things that is that style. And oftentimes that is very far from the truth.
Yeah.
They're pulling from all sorts of things and filtering it through themselves.
Definitely.
Very cool. Nathan, I saw you have a question.
Yeah, there is a lot going on in this. Where did it start? Like, what was your initial idea and how did it grow out of that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm pretty sure. So I have this like old Casio keyboard here. Actually, let me see if I can just play those. I think it was this. Maybe it was this one. I think it was like this sound. Hopefully it works. Nope. Okay. When it's done doing this, it will work. But it was basically this this Casio keyboard that I was running through like guitar pedals, and I was just like I was just trying to like find sounds to do things. I didn't really have like a song in mind or anything, but I just got this cool kind of drone sound that I really liked, and started building on top of that. And you know, like I mentioned, it was like I knew this was going to be rhythmic. I knew I wanted it to kind of like be a bold opening statement. So I kind of had like a energy in mind, but I really don't write like I really don't start from melodies. I start more from chords and I start more from textures. So I build like, you know, the kind of main melody that you hear going on throughout was probably one of the last things that actually was in there. I was more focused on sort of like the what, you know, what's happening around those. So let me see if this will play now. Not good. But yeah, so I think that I'm gonna restart Logic. Sorry guys. I think that, yeah, for me, I'm definitely more focused on texture and chords. So that was definitely where this one started. The drum, the kind of like, I don't know if it comes through Zoom, but there's drums that are like, I think there's like 3 drum sets that are sort of like panned different places. So you can kind of hear like 2 in like left and right, and then there's one down the middle, and they're doing like kind of variations on the same thing. And that, you know, that kind of creates this sort of like dizzying kind of thing. So it's like creating more like rooms that you're in rather than, like a through line narrative. I think that's kind of where I start for most things. I think I've tried to, like, just as a challenge to myself, try to start from like a melody or like just on a piano, form song structures just like that, like more like a lead sheet. But I definitely start more from trying to create texture.
A lead sheet, for people who don't know, is a melody written out, and then you have the chords written above it. So it's sort of just like the melodic and harmonic, down to its bare bones, pretty much.
Yeah.
While Logic is loading, can you talk about, like, you were talking about starting with textures and chords? What kind of textures are you talking about? Are you talking about field recordings sometimes? Like, has that inspired a piece?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely been it's so one thing, and we can the next piece I'll show has a little bit more of this, but it's I've gotten more into like yeah, taking a field recording. So I have like I have like a recorder that I take most places with me, which your iPhones also work well for this, but I have this kind of like Zoom recorder thing. And if you hear something cool, or if I'm just sitting down reading a book or like at a cafe or something, just like place it on a table and let it run for 5 minutes. And you can find things like actually, I think this would be a good, the intro has a bit of this when it's loading. So the intro has this sound that kind of sounds like a trumpet a little bit, but it's actually, like when you rub a glass, kind of the brim with a wet finger, kind of makes this sort of like crystal sound. So it's that sound, and we were sitting around my table at Christmas with my family. We were all just kind of doing that for fun, and I just put my phone out and took a recording of that. And then in Logic, you can basically like place it across the keyboard, like a MIDI keyboard, and then it pitches it to those sounds.
We're going to be doing this in class tomorrow, putting it into a sampler.
Yes, nice. So here, let's hope, fingers crossed, this will not work. So I'll play, so this is the like intro to the album, and I'll just play the kind of this is all from the same recording of the glass. So that's a little example of
That's
sort
beautiful.
of like, thank you. Yeah, it's the I think that, so yeah, when I'm saying textures, I think that especially for me, because I don't really work with like text or writing lyrics or poems, and so if there is an emotional sort of element to something, it's more like me, it's like a memory, or it's like an image, or it's something like that. And sitting around a table at Christmas with your family is kind of like, that's that places you somewhere, both like physically and like as a emotional place. And I think that's not explicitly heard, or something that I tell, but it's not like written in the song that that's where it is. But while I'm writing it, I'm in that place while I'm trying to make chords or melodies or something like that with that, with that recording, I'm in that place. So I feel like, if that's where I am, a listener might be able to, project their own similar emotional place on that. So I think that that's one thing I really like about field recordings is it, at least for me, it kind of places me because I think I'm very more image, I'm inspired much more by image. So I think that that's why I like the field recording sort of side of things a little more.
I feel like the part that I feel like a lot of people can relate to what you just said, and I feel like what you just played for us, that could be its own composition right there.
Yeah.
That could be a whole piece.
Yes.
So you have that
Yeah,
stuff like buried throughout. Are there any other questions? I feel like we should move on to another
Yeah, totally.
piece of music, but are there any other questions for Dan?
They can be not about this piece too, just about life stuff or completely
true.
things or whatever. Oh, this other thing opened up.
I'm curious, like how you determine what is a good, like, do you seek out a field recording, or like, what grabs your ear and makes you want to be like, I want to record that?
That's a good question. I was thinking about that more recently because I'm in the kind of the after finishing a big project, figuring out what's up next. Like I had all my tricks for this thing, and I kind of want to do something a little different. So how do I like relearn the entire thing in a way that makes the next thing? So I mean, for this one, I definitely kind of had things I was listening for that I knew would kind of fit into the whatever vibe or anything like that. But I think I really love I mean, like there's things like cars driving, or like a idling bus, or something like that, where there's like a hum and you don't immediately hear a pitch or something like that, but you can like kind of EQ things or add some sort of like distortion or harmonics thing to sort of bump up different frequencies so that you get a pitch. So it kind of sounds like a, in that case, the glass sounded like a little bit like a trumpet with a mute in it or something like that. So I think I like the sort of like long sustained tones where I know I can sort of like mess with it a little bit. Another thing is just like, I don't know, crunching sounds or things like that are always really fun because you sort of get, you can try and plot out a drum beat or something or like a rhythm, but you kind of, especially working in these programs, sometimes you get, no matter how hard you try not to, you get a little bit stuck to the grid, kind of end up placing things in like the expected places, which is, that's good for, it's not a bad thing, but like if you're trying to, in that last song, like if it was just kind of like a basic like backbeat kind of thing, which happens a little bit, but it kind of, for me, it didn't seem like it fit. So yeah, just like the crinkling noises, you get like rhythms that you would never think of yourself, and just kind of, you can chop it up a little bit to create a little bit more sense out of it. But I think those two things, at least for this
But
project,
you're like discovering natural rhythms and sort of like
exactly.
adjusting them a little bit, but
Yeah,
trying to keep the flavor.
exactly.
Cool.
All right, so I'll play this tune. This one's probably more in like the soundscape kind of world. And this one used about 5 different recordings, longer recordings. There's one of like just messing around on a synth. It's kind of like a loud, kind of aggressive synth sound that happens a few times. There's a recording of some voices singing in a garage, but they're kind of distant, like the microphone's a little further away from them. And then there's a clarinet and a chair that's like when you drag a chair on the ground and it kind of like squeaks a little bit. There's that. So this one's kind of slower, a little more down tempo, but it kind of starts with a hit. So there we go. Fingers crossed Logic likes me now.
Beautiful. That, I feel like that brought me into like a meditative kind of place.
Yeah,
Felt
yeah,
great.
definitely. Yeah, this one's called Shell, and it's kind of in the middle of the album. It's kind of one of those like reset buttons. There's a lot. There's a lot of like the kind of more rhythmic stuff, and then gets a little bit slower in the middle, and then kind of ends more with like what we heard before. So
Any questions for Dan? That bass. Wow.
yeah, I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to remember what that was. I could kind of dive into the sampler instruments a little bit. Oh, I see Nathan. You have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With all this textural stuff.
Yeah.
It's so like open and like atmospheric. How do you like find what direction you're going with it?
Direction, sort of. You mean like direction in terms of like kind of like song form?
Well, like song form, and also like you say that you like to start with the texture. How do you take that and like develop it? Because it's so
Yeah, I think that I think that I think that as you get I don't know, I'd be curious also to hear what Eric has to say about this, but I feel like like if I think that I started this started with like this chord progression. It was kind of like those two chords back and forth, like little variations of them. So, you know, I have a solid like 2 minutes of stuff that I really like. And so then you kind of like just as you do this more, and this is definitely, I've felt this is like you kind of just have your tricks that you just kind of go to, or you like, you know, one thing, I'm trying to remember which one it was. You know, there's like that for that long, you know, there's like felt like it needed to go someplace. So I'm like, okay, what? There's like these plugins that I know I like. There's this plugin called Little Alter Boy that I like a lot, and I just like sent it through this, which kind of changes like pitch and something called formant. And I just like, you know, I turned up the drive so it's going really, it's like heavily going through it, and like there's like big changes, and then it sounded like this. And like that's a little weird for it doesn't like really fit the vibe of the track. So then I basically just like took a bunch of that extra stuff out, and you kind of just get like a floaty thing. So I would say, you know, when there's these times when you kind of have, like you were saying, these very open moments, and it, you know, it seems, you know, that chord progression is sort of the piece, but then it's sort of about how you just like add the little things that sort of drive it forward. So, you know, like the little floaty, like sparkly bits are like just a little something that like, you know, perks your attention when it gets up there. The bass isn't, you know, it's another thing that like comes in halfway through this, and it's just like pretty heavy. And these sort of like big hits are something that came last. I thought that it needed some sort of like, it's not really necessarily rhythm, but it does like pace it a little bit. You know, there's like 4 of them, I think, ish. There's kind of a half of one too. So that's sort of just like marking time basically. So there's a way for you to get from A to B. And so that's a long way of saying there's like just these tricks. So there's, you know, there's just these things that you think about. There's things that I'm thinking about that are like the songs that I like, what did they do well? And I think that for me, I always admire like the subtle changes that, you know, like make me pay attention, but it's not like, it doesn't have to be a left turn. It doesn't have to be like a new song. It can just be like, it could be like one single note that all of a sudden comes in that's at the top, that's just like floating at the top, but it like completely changes everything. So I always am kind of trying to find those things.
Good question, Nathan. We only have a few minutes left, so get your last questions in here before we thank Dan and get out of here. Yeah, Anthony.
Okay, so when you do like, do you record everything and then you just put it all in like one track and then you mesh it all together and then that's what you get? And then
Somewhat, yeah. I think let me know if I'm not understanding the question right, but I do. So I usually have sort of like one. So for example, these 2 tracks are kind of, they're the same thing, but I think that they're like slightly different. They're like different EQs, or I don't know, something like that. So I do try and like stick to one. I try and stick to as little as possible, and like just find ways to reuse that stuff. So there'll be a recording of, you know, like the chair squeaking or something like that, and then from that you could, you know, like make it twice as long, so it kind of sounds like slower and low, but it's from the same thing, so there's like a little bit of a connection. So yeah, all of the tracks, and same with the last tune, which had a lot more tracks, but you know, a lot of those are the same like audio, just kind of flipped in a different way, flipped something is like a little bit different from it. And I think that that's a good, if you're stuck, I think I kind of said this before, if you're stuck, trying to find ways that you can reuse what you have rather than starting from scratch and putting something new in is always helps kind of have more of a cohesive song, and just sort of it's a good limitation to put on yourself.
I think we got to end there, but that's a great place to end on, because we're in the middle of the week. These composers are working on their pieces. If you're stuck, try reusing something that you already have, flip it in a new way. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, of course. I'll drop my email in the chat. Feel free to, if you have any questions or
Oh, yeah.
whatever, feel free.
Excellent. All right. Thanks so much.
Sweet. Yeah. See y'all.